So the first rapid fire question is, can stress alone cause physical illness?
Yes.
Number two, is burnout just being tired or something more serious?
No, it's way more than just being tired.
Number three, do high achieving women often ignore the early signs of health issues related to burnout?
Absolutely, yes.
Does meditation have measurable effects on our brain and the body?
Absolutely, yes.
Is multitasking actually less productive than focusing on one thing at a time? Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hormones and Hope. This is your host, Dr. Chhaya Makhija. And today it's my delight, my pleasure, and excitement to introduce you to Dr. Rashmi Schramm. This is going to be a very special episode. I know I usually say every episode is special or exclusive, but this is truly special because it's going to touch your heart and soul. Dr. Rashmi Schramm is a board certified family physician. She's a very seasoned physician with more than 2 decades of experience. And now she's completely focused on coaching, teaching, educating, and hosting retreats, especially for women, physicians, or busy women to tap into their own inner peace and power. And that's the same title of her own podcast. Her mission is to just bring about more liveliness, more energy, and fulfilling lives. So I'm very, very delighted to introduce you to Dr. Schramm. Dr. Schramm, welcome to our podcast. And, thank you for being a guest. I'm honored. Please tell us more about yourself. Anything which could be, which could enlighten us as a person, as a human being.
Well, first, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. You actually were on my podcast, and that's coming out soon. It's such a fantastic collaboration that we have here. I love your podcast. So I'll start with that. So, a little bit about me. I was born in Bangalore, India, which is in the South. I lived in a very large extended family until I was 11, almost 12, at which point we immigrated to the US. And during that period of time, I was very close to my grandmother, the matriarch of the family. And she, over those years, instilled within me, I was the oldest grandkid and also a girl. And so I was very close to her. And for a long time, I was the only grandchild and the only child around. There were lots of adults around. So I got the real honor of being able to watch how she moved through with a lot of indigenous wisdom, whether it was Ayurvedic wisdom, yogic wisdom, meditative wisdom, a very spiritual place, not necessarily religious, but very spiritual. And it was just part of our everyday lives. And she was, I joke, she was the like the OG feminist. She would teach me mantras that were only meant for boys, for example. Like she was really making sure that I got to understand some of the roots of where my ancestry came from. And so we fast forward into sixth grade, which is already a tumultuous period of time. We immigrated to a small coal mining town in the Appalachian Mountains where I finished middle school and high school. And so, for safety reasons, mental, emotional safety reasons, I had to completely abandon all of those practices, kind of leave that part of myself behind and assimilate into the culture, which served me well. I went off to college. And when I was in college, I actually found a group that was meditating and actually was able to integrate myself into that group. I call myself a closet meditator because at that time I was applying for medical school and it didn't feel safe for me to talk about it. And this was, in the early 1990s. And so fast forward through medical school, abandoned all the things again, residency, no connection again. And then I have young kids. I'm an attending. My husband is working a lot. I'm working a lot. It's a great, perfect setup for just a disillusionment. From the outside, my world looked pretty darn amazing. I had the kids, I had the car, I had the house, I had the vacations, I had the whatever. But on the inside, I was a dumpster fire. I mean, I was just super burnt out. I was always snapping at people I loved the most. That, I waited until I had physical symptoms of burnout, not just emotional or mental symptoms, which I think is very common. And at that time, this was before social media. I didn't know anyone other than local people necessarily. And everyone around me seemed burned out and sort of disillusioned as well. And it was just like, well, this is just how it is, the American dream. And I'm like, I don't buy it. I don't think so. And so I started to look into ways in which I could incorporate some of the things that I knew internally would be super helpful for me. And so I actually started meditating again. And this time I was a crisis meditator, right? Like the kind that would meditate for like 2 or 3 months at a time. My migraines would get better, my GI issues would get better, and then I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm done." And then they would all come back. And so after a while, after a few cycles of those, I said, "Well, I need some external accountability. I need a community is what I really need." And that was when I joined the Chipro Global program, and they were doing a teacher training program. That was the most in-depth sort of yogic wisdom that I could find at that time. And I had 0 interest in teaching. I joined that program because I needed the deep dive, and the program was a couple years long, and it was like, "Hey, if you wanna come out and say you're a meditation teacher, you're gonna have to sign here and say you're gonna meditate twice a day." And I was like, "Sign me up, sign me up." And so it was a really amazing immersion, if you will, over a long period of time into Vedanta, into those teachings that I was able to just kinda start to incorporate into my practice, into my own life. And as it started to help me, part and parcel of finishing that program was teaching. And so I started teaching at the local Y. I was teaching my office staff. I was, like, basically teaching anybody that would listen to me and just getting my reps in as far as that goes. And obviously, anytime as a teacher, what I've learned, certainly as a facilitator, anytime you're giving, you're receiving as well. And so each time I was deepening my own practice. And so when COVID hit, I had been practicing for 22 years at that point. And when COVID hit, I had never been on Zoom, did not know what it was, had never done any kind of meditative practice online. But a few friends reached out and they said, "Don't you do this stuff at the Y? Can you do this if I set up a Zoom?" And I'm like, "I don't think it's gonna work on Zoom, guys, like, I don't think so." And then they were like, "But please," it was this group of people in New York, and, New York was really hit deeply hard, and I was like, "Well, if you think it'll help." And at that point, it was so I teach a few different kinds of meditation. I teach a mantra meditation, through a particular lineage, and then I also teach an advanced yoga nidra practice as well. And so I started to just offer it for free in early 2020 at the same time that I had launched a coaching practice as well. And it really took off like wildfire. And I did not realize the need and the potential for that kind of connection online. And so it's really grown since then. And it has really evolved into just this beautiful community. I do some online groups, I do one on one coaching. That's the bulk of what I do now. I work with women mostly. And I also host in-person retreats. And so, if somebody would have told me 5 years ago, this is where you're going to end up, I would have laughed at them because really my reason for taking any of those sort of lessons or classes, if you will, because that first one was just the gateway. Like as most of us are, I was like, is there another test I can take? Is there like another take? And so I have a ridiculous number of certifications that no one needs. But for my own edification, but ultimately, all of it, I think, ties me back together. It feels like a very full circle thing to part and parcel of who and what I was when I was growing up.
This is very inspiring. I loved a few things that were very new to me. One was crisis meditation, which I'll have you elaborate further. And the way you broke it down, the burnout is described as, and the disillusion. You're speaking to our hearts and souls. As simple as that. This is very inspiring. I need to learn more after the podcast for sure. So, Dr. Schramm, I'm so, so, so excited to hear more from you now. And I'll be the quiet one. So, we'll start with the rapid fire, which should be very quick with a simple one liner or yes or no or true or false. And then I'm willing to just have you take over, which is always the case, but this time a lot about what you just expressed about your experience. This is mind blowing. So the first rapid fire question is: can stress alone cause physical illness?
Yes. Should I elaborate or is that for later?
For later, I think your experience also, when you added, you specifically mentioned the physical manifestations other than the burnout. So, yes, please elaborate on that. Number two, is burnout just being tired or something more serious?
No, it's way more than just being tired.
Number three, do high achieving women often ignore the early signs of health issues related to burnout?
Absolutely, yes.
Does meditation have measurable effects on our brain and the body?
Absolutely, yes.
Is multitasking actually less productive than focusing on one thing at a time?
Yes, monotasking is best.
Can just 10 minutes of mindfulness a day make a difference or transformation?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. 10 minutes, people. Is self care more than just spa days or vacations?
Yes.
All right. Now we get into deep dive. So I'll have you answer because it was the first question that we talked about. Can stress alone cause physical illness? So I would love to know what your take is, what your experience is, and what you actually teach your clients, your busy women professionals.
For sure. If it's okay with you, I want to bring in some neuroscience that will, of course, bring in some ancient wisdom with us as well. But when we think about stress, we think about either work stress or home stress or something like that. But I want to just define stress as the way that I define it is the perception of a threat, physical, mental, or emotional, right? It's a perception of a threat. And so it is very clear that we all, as human beings, need a certain level of stress called eustress. And it's also very clear that the vast majority of us human beings have way more stress in our lives than is appropriate for what our system was built for. So, kind of having established that, I want to kind of set a precedent for modern day lives in the form of polyvagal theory, in that it's a little bit different than when I went to medical school. I was taught just the parasympathetic and sympathetic. And so this breaks it down into actually three components. So we know what the sympathetic overdrive is. We know that's fight or flight, right? It is hugely helpful as of like this morning. I was literally walking home on my normal walk in a crosswalk and I almost got run over by a car that didn't see me, that I thought saw me. And so, thanks to my sympathetic nervous system, I was able to jump out of the way in time. My heart rate increased in case I needed to run. My blood was drained from my prefrontal cortex because I couldn't quite make a lot of great decisions at that time. But it was, siphoned into my large muscles. All of the things that were appropriate happened. So we don't want to demonize the sympathetic drive. It is life saving, literally. And that is why we have it. The problem is in our modern day lives, we tend to stay in that sympathetic overdrive because we've got more emails than we ever get to reply to. We have more work than we ever have time to do. We have more expectations from others and ourselves. And life is moving faster and faster. Like I could go on and on. I don't need to tell your listeners or you why we're feeling stressed. There are 1,001 reasons why we're feeling stressed. Now, what happens when we're in that sympathetic overdrive for a very long period of time? You know what happens endocrine wise. I know that you talk about this in your podcast, but long term chronic increase in cortisol can have all kinds of downstream effects that I know you talk about. So I won't necessarily go into that too much. But the other thing that will happen when we are in that sympathetic overdrive for a long period of time, it's metabolically costly, and the body, the nervous system will move us into what's known as dorsal vagal. And so that's, I think of dorsal disconnect. And so dorsal disconnect, we all know what that feels like when we actually kind of feel calm, we look kind of calm, but we're totally disconnected from ourselves. We're totally disembodied, which means that we really can't connect with other people. So it can become someone's home who has chronically lived in that overdrive. And we sometimes call it the freeze response, but it looks like we're moving through the motions. So that's one thing to kind of take note of. That was really the big shift that happened when polyvagal theory came in, right? And so then we think of what do we generally think of the parasympathetic response, rest and digest. That's now known as ventral vagal response. And so ventral vagal response really is talking about our capacity to connect with others, to co-regulate with others, to feel peaceful internally so that we can actually be paying attention. And that is actually a lot of what mindfulness practices do is it brings us into the ventral vagal response. There's of course lots of other practices that bring us into ventral vagal. And when we think about like nervous system regulation, it is not always staying in ventral vagal. It's pretty impossible to do that, but it's becoming aware. What state am I in? What flavor does it have? Is it appropriate? Am I, running a half marathon? I kind of need to be in sympathetic. Like I'm not trying to be super calm when I'm running or, vice versa. If I'm lifting weights, it has to have flavors of all of those things. It's noticing when we're dysregulated so we can re-regulate is really that that capacity and that strength that we get to have when we have a long-term practice.
Beautiful. This was also very insightful for me because as you're explaining it, especially the body wiggle theory and breaking it down. So this was the neuroscience, right? If I can just tie in with one of our questions about mindfulness, because you brought that up, and how is it more of a ventral response? So, what is it? What is mindfulness? And if you can break it down, how, if I'm completely new to this and I'm experiencing the pain points that you're really talking about, right? If I'm right now listening to you. So, what is my first few steps? Awareness, like you talked about. So, what awareness and knowledge do I need to know or gain from you today about what is mindfulness? And how do I take myself to this, at least experiencing a snippet of the ventral response that you just talked about?
So, mindfulness, as is a kind of an accepted definition, is the awareness that arises when we are paying attention to this present moment on purpose and without judgment and with curiosity. It's a very simple thing. We're just paying attention, we're noticing what's arising, right? And if you've ever been around little kids, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they are already always mindful. They're already always aware. They're already always curious and they're not judging. And so I point that out to show us that that is our innate state. That is actually our innate state when we are born as human beings. And of course, as time goes on, of stress, layers of roles, layers of expectations kind of keep us from understanding that that is our essential state of being is mindfulness, is that awareness that arises, is that non-judgment that arises. Non-judgment, not just about other people, but non-judgment about ourselves, which could be really a beautiful practice to have as well. And so meditation, the way I think of it, is just a formal practice of mindfulness. And how I talk to my students about meditation is it is moving from activity into stillness or moving from activity into silence. So that stillness and that silence, they were already always there. We're not creating it. We're just creating a pathway to touch that within our own selves. And so that's the first sort of definition, right? And so the next question that you asked was, how can somebody get started, right? There is not a one size fits all for how somebody can practice mindfulness. My guess is whoever's listening may already have their own practice, but not call it mindfulness. Things that come to mind are just walking outside, noticing the trees, noticing the birds, noticing the sky, even traffic. Like any awareness practices is mindfulness. A yoga asana practice is a mindful practice because we're pairing the breath with the body. And if we're not in the body during a pose, we are going to fail at that pose. So that's why yoga is kind of a foolproof way to get into it. But some people they don't wanna do any of those things, no worries. So what is it that you feel most connected to? So sometimes I have clients who will just go for a walk on the beach if that's accessible to them. They will go rock climbing because you cannot be anywhere else other than in your body when you're doing an activity like rock climbing or surfing, for example. Like any of those activities, any kind of playful activity can be your mindfulness practice. And of course, if you're motivated or drawn to a seated practice, that's also a really fast track to get you on the mindfulness train, if you will.
With this, the mindfulness and practicing it is more like meditation. How are you rather breaking these? I could call it as a myth or just a misconception that meditation is sitting at a specific location with your doors closed or windows closed and just trying to read your thoughts. And especially my younger patients, they'll tell me, I just can't live with my thoughts. I just can't. So, how do you approach these kind of individuals? How do you break it down or simplify it even further?
Yeah, by the way, it's not just my younger folks. I mean, it's people all over the age spectrum that will say, I cannot be with my thoughts. It's a very common thing, right? And then there's also a very common myth that we have to control our thoughts, which, my God, I don't know how to do. So, the idea is that where we put our attention is where our energy flows. And so, let's say, for example, during meditative practice, you start to have, a train of thoughts. That's what we do. The brain produces up to 80,000 thoughts a day. That is what it's meant to do. So thoughts aren't bad. We're not trying to control the thoughts and we're not trying to just, be without thoughts. I don't know anyone that can sit without thoughts. What we're shifting is our relationship to those thoughts. What we're shifting is from an identity to the thoughts and emotions that arise to being the witness of those. And so when we can practice being the witness of our thoughts, there is a spaciousness. There's a space that opens up in there. And that is that magic that can start to happen. And what is required is self compassion during any seated meditation practice because, there are four valid sort of experiences during a meditative practice I teach. So the first one is you're following the mantra or you're following the guidance. That's a valid experience during a meditation. You might notice that you are having a lot of racing thoughts or you're feeling really restless. That is a valid experience during a meditative practice because you are noticing that you are having those thoughts and feelings, right? The other one can be you can fall asleep. That is the most common thing that I will see, right? When your body needs the rest, it will take the rest. So the fourth experience, it's a valid experience, is what we call turiya or turiya, which is an experience of blissful state, right? And so sort of in a down translation, it's, glimpsing of the soul, if you will. And so we hear those four experiences and we immediately, because we're so driven by metrics, we're like, I want to be in Turiya all the time. And the minute that we have that thought, we will never get there. Because so much of being in that state is a surrender, is a letting go, which is a great practice for us outside of our seated meditative practice as well. How much can we let go when we're not in our practice? And so it is really a microcosm of how you can deal with all of the chaos that's happening in the world. And so when we look at those really very practical experiences during a meditative practice, then we no longer have to be attached to the idea of feeling a certain way. If we get to feel a certain way, that's wonderful. But I meditate every day, and I believe you do too. And I don't think that every day I'm reaching a state of bliss. A lot of times I do, but I certainly know that, and we can talk about some of the neuroscientific benefits. I know for a fact that I'm still getting the benefits, regardless of if I fell asleep or if I noticed I was just restless and I had 10,000 thoughts in my 30-minute meditation. And all I did was come back to my mantra or my guided parts of it or my breath. It doesn't matter. It becomes irrelevant because the minute we start to judge a practice, we're no longer in mindfulness.
Yeah, I love this point of the let go and surrender because we are conditioned in general. You talked about the innate attribute that we have, right? That the peace that we are actually born with, or even before we were born, that's like our innate quality, and then getting conditioned with how the world is structured, how systems are organized. And this leads to sort of competition with our own selves. And even when there is this pathway to find peace, to find your own self, there is this sense of the competition that I need to get there. And when I say I need to get there, I'm losing my identity because I'm already there. It's that peace. It's that just surrender, like you said. And I don't think there's any religion, any culture bias right there because it's just one universal power that we are all connected with, and it's just recognizing it. It's just being aware of it. I find this very cool right now. I could just go on and on listening to you and learning more. But you mentioned while answering this about the neuroscientific benefits. So, from your experience, especially you coming as a master, as a teacher, what have you seen in the practices that your students are actually, gaining those lessons and implementing? And of course, what's the literature, what's the evidence out there?
Yeah. And I most identify with being a student. If sometimes I hear the word like meditation expert and I sort of cringe because that's not a thing. That doesn't exist. We're all meditation experts if you really think about it, because we're just reaching an innate state that's already always there. So your question really had to do with what are some of those neuroscientific benefits and what have I seen in the folks that I work with. And so neuroscientifically, I mean, we now have tens of thousands of studies. And I sometimes joke that the biggest evidence we have is we can trace this back to every ancient wisdom tradition all over the world, as well as in the lineage in which I study, we can trace it back to 5,000 years. And so uh, if there was a practice that was painstakingly sort of, kept from teacher to student for 5,000 years, it must have some kind of incredible benefit, right? And so the yogis have known that for thousands of years. And ultimately, science I think of as catching up to what the ancient yogis already always knew. And so let's talk about some of the practical ways that we can look at it. So, neuroscientifically, the brain literally physiologically changes with a long term meditator. And so the gray matter within the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher level thinking, emotional regulation, all of that stuff it actually gets bigger. So that's pretty incredible. And we have increased neuroplasticity, which is our capacity to adapt and learn new habits. That's also shifted. The other thing that we notice is a downregulation of the HPA axis, right? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so what that can do for us is it lowers the cortisol that I already mentioned over long periods of time when we have cortisol also is not, I don't need to get into that with you, but it gets sort of demonized, but of course we have to have it. And so it's the same as the sympathetic, overdrive. It's meant to save our lives, but not if it's over, 40 years of our lives. And so when cortisol goes down, we know that lots of different things can start to shift. Our fertility can shift, the entire system shifts when long-term cortisol is down. And then immunity can improve as well, right? And so what we start to notice from all of those things, just what I notice is increased self-awareness. I mean, everything has to start with awareness. We talked about that a little bit. Without that, we can't make any shift in our lives. And so I see significantly increased self-awareness. What's also interesting is even if somebody didn't necessarily have symptoms of depression or anxiety, those symptoms alleviate. And the way in which that tends to work is, and this has been studied and can be reproduced, is over a 3-week period when someone practiced a 30-minute meditation a day, 5 days a week, what we saw in those studies was a 40 to 60% increase in serotonin and norepinephrine. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And up to a 60% increase in dopamine. And so cravings tend to go down, awareness tends to go up, and those neurotransmitters can be just a clue, just a small clue as to what else is happening within the body. And ultimately, there is kind of a knowing that even when there's a shakeup, that with 1 or 2 breaths, you know how to get back to yourself. You know how to be in a regulated state, even when there's sort of everything is sort of breaking down outside.
Now, the percentages are large. Wow, I did not know that. The 60% in dopamine and 30 to 40% in serotonin, like you said. Wow.
Yeah, and it's sustained. It's sustained as long as somebody continues a meditation practice. It was actually published, I want to say in JAMA about 4 years ago. It was a very large study they did with escitalopram, which is one of the more common SSRIs that we use. And it had the same equivalent number of relief with anxiety and depression, mindfulness based stress reduction, which is really a meditative practice compared with escitalopram. It's hard to do double blind placebo controlled, the way that we do for pharma things, but we do the best that we can.
Yeah. There are certain things which cannot necessarily be the randomized controlled trials. And with, just like we have pregnancy, right? We can't test every drug to see if it's safe in pregnancy or not. Similarly, this is a lot to do with self experience. And if two individuals who've experienced it are talking about it or expressing it, you like feel like, oh my gosh, I exactly feel the same thing. It's beyond expressing in words. But that's what I feel right now, the connection, even though you're far away from me physically. So this is like mind blowing in terms of percentages, and I feel like this is also encouraging, right? That when people who believe in science or who need data, there is great evidence to show that this is a great prescription to actually use in our daily lives. I wanted to touch base on this, Dr. Rashmi, is in our rapid fire we talked about burnout, and you specifically said that it's beyond the physical manifestations. So, can you help us just differentiate between fatigue exhaustion versus burnout? And I think you personally also experienced that during your professional and early professional journey, and that led you to this space where you're at right now. So, could you elaborate on that, the burnout aspect of what it is and how can one identify it?
Yeah, absolutely. So burnout actually has a definition according to the World Health Organization. And there's also pretty well documented mental, emotional, physical symptoms that tend to be fairly universal for most people. They can have a different flavor of it. And so burnout, it turns out, is actually recurrent and relapsing. So yes, I burned out, during my early time, and it was a really terrible burnout. And then I built a business that burned me out too because I was familiar with that. And so it can be a very familiar cycle. And I tend to see it in my clients as well, is that we can, create a business that actually burns us out. And it's not necessarily like a terrible, awful failure. It's just that we are multi-passionate, really talented, driven human beings, right? The very things that get us those accomplishments and successes when it tips over the edge is burnout. And so we don't want to vilify it, just like we're not vilifying anything. But burnout can present as, yes, of course, exhaustion, right? That is one of the most common things that we see. And if you think about it, if you have burned through all of your energy, you're also burned through your creative capacity. That's one of the more kind of common things that we'll see. It becomes very simplistic, all or nothing thinking, and really highly intellectual individuals to where like not uncommonly, let's take, for example, the entrepreneurs, sort of when an entrepreneur burns out and I'm talking to them, they're like, I'm going to sell this whole thing. I can't take it. I just want to like run away from everything. Right. And so, and that is the lack of the creative thinking, not because they don't have that capacity. It's because they don't have that capacity right now. They are fully burned out. They're completely out of all their reserves. And so we can have caregiver burnout. That tends to happen a lot if we're taking care of aging parents or young kids or even a partner who might be ill for a long period of time. We can burn out that way. We can burn out just in general, aside from work and caretaking. We can burn out from like making so many decisions every single day. And, that we can have decision fatigue as well. And so it can present, yes, as exhaustion even after like 8 hours of sleep, for example. It can present as irritability, can present as a lot of these look like depression and anxiety symptoms. And so sometimes we call it depression or anxiety, but a lot of times it's burnout. And so it can be this, grayness, just a chronic kind of grayness. There's no amount of accomplishment that can help us feel like we've done enough. It's that like constant drive. And the thing is, like, society doesn't really help us out with that because, we have this like hustle culture and busyness is a sign of it's a of, sort of like, look at me. I have status because I'm always so busy. I don't have any time for you. Like all of those things are fed into us. We did not create this ourselves. Like we see it all the time. It's a glorified thing. Burnout is glorified. And what are some of the answers that society gives us? Like, oh, you probably need the other productivity hack. No, you don't. You need to rest. And so a lot of the symptoms of burnout can look like depression or anxiety, loss of capacity to kind of even use all of our cylinders, if you will. And yet the thing that we need the most is something that society kind of shames us for.
That's impressive because I can relate with it, and I don't have to share my story here, but absolutely. And there's this fine line where it's very easy to slip into versus when you describe the awareness part of it, I think we can catch ourselves sooner before getting into that state, which then it's difficult, I feel. So yeah. And when you mentioned about your crisis meditation, that's what, many of us have done it. I've done it in terms of approaching it that, okay, this will fix the problem. But you brought back even this, the science of, what did you say, 30 minutes for 5 days?
Yes, that's what the science was. Yeah.
Yeah. In the real world. And, when we have our listeners or viewers watching it, what could you leave them with? And then I wanted to ask you about, how are you coaching? How are you conducting these sessions in your world? But what could you leave the audience with in terms of here are some simple steps or practical strategies that once you've recognized what burnout is or how to prevent to get into that phase, what can they do? The awareness, yes, but some practical steps that might be beneficial before they get into, a deep dive of understanding that this is actually useful for me.
For sure. I think starting small is always the key. And yes, I mentioned that study with the 30 minutes just to kind of show what is possible when somebody is they were in the study. They had agreed to meditate for that long period of time. But I think our amygdala would completely shut down, which is the alarm center in the brain. If somebody who'd never meditated before, if they were presented with the idea of you got to do 30 minutes or nothing, they would say, I'm doing nothing. And so for almost all of my clients, we start with 2 or 3 minutes a day. And we literally just start with like a pranayama or breathwork practice because that can actually bring them into regulation very quickly. It can actually create a neural pathway where they can sit for another 2 or 3 minutes. And so I would say if you are not accustomed to a meditation practice, 5 minutes is a great place to start. 2 minutes of noticing your breathing is a great place to start. You don't need anything fancy. You don't need any of these fancy, like, I don't know, I've seen goggles or like head, like, you don't need any of that. It's already always there. And so, and you don't need to go find a banyan tree. Just, if you want to try it out, you can certainly try any of the apps that are out there. There are lots and lots of apps that are out there. But a lot of times there's a trap within the apps I've found, which is interesting in that people get this idea that every time it has to feel really novel. And so they spend like 4 out of their 5 minutes looking for and picking out the most perfect meditation. And then they only have like 1 minute to meditate. And so I always like just keep it simple. Just turn out a timer, do, whatever it is, just sit down and close your eyes and notice your breath and notice your thoughts and you're done. And so that's always a really great place to start. If it's not safe for somebody to sit down, meaning if somebody is dealing with deep grief or they're dealing with a lot of trauma, it just doesn't feel safe to sit down, and that's okay. Sometimes we have to incorporate the body into it. And so, what feels good for you? Walking is incredibly helpful, especially walking in nature. So, can you walk for 5 or 6 minutes unplugged from AirPods or phones or anything else like that? That is beneficial. So, starting small, keeping it consistent, and having it be an experiential thing, at least initially, without necessarily feeling like, oh, this is the prescription that I have to follow. If somebody is very disciplined, like I have 2 daughters, my younger one is like, if you looked up discipline in the dictionary, like her face would pop up. Like she needs to know exactly the amount of time, she will follow it, and she will get it done. But, most of us aren't quite like that. And so most people need a soft approach to how is it that I can just be present right now?
I've had few patients actually, which rings me a bell. The breath work and when we teach them, or it's blood pressure is high, and just go over those breath techniques. But many of them, when they're going through these phases, life's challenges, they'll tell me, "I can't close my eyes." Then I do the same thing, just keep my eyes open because I end up getting more anxiety. So you're so right. It's like what feels right to you, and start from there. That's beautiful. Walking, people, walking. I have to give you a high five, Dr. Rashmi, for that. Food for the soul. Absolutely, absolutely. So tell us, how can we get know or learn more about your teachings, or how to get into your world? And then I know that you organize retreats too. So please add, I shine some light here, so that step one or simple practical strategies that you've given us, how can those be optimized or enhanced further if anyone wants to reach out?
For sure. So, the easiest and fastest way for people to find me is my podcast, which is called Inner Peace and Power. It's available on all platforms. And Dr. Makhija is going to be on there next week, actually. So, that's going to be fantastic. My website is just rashmishram.com. You can find all sorts of things there, resources for yourself. I have a YouTube channel. And there's lots of resources and meditations there. I should add that there are lots of meditative practices within the podcast itself. So, there are probably 8 or 9 guided meditations that you could choose from, and they're all completely free and available. Same on YouTube. They're, a combination of ancient wisdom and modern science, and sometimes also talk about the benefits of it before I lead somebody through a meditative practice. And so, if somebody's intrigued by it, that's a really great place to start. Oftentimes, that is plenty and enough. But if somebody wants to kind of reach out or go into a deeper dive on my website, you can also schedule a discovery call with me as well. And I do host retreats. The 2025 ones are sold out currently, but there'll be more coming in 2026. So stay tuned.
All right. Yeah. We'll add those links, and I would love to gather just those, also the seven, you said, the videos or the podcast episodes, specifically on the meditation. This is great. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Schramm. This was actually truly an episode for your heart and soul. I look forward to learning more from you, Dr. Schramm, in our near future episodes. And tune in for our episode here, as well as watch it on YouTube. Until then, it's Dr. Makija. Ciao.